Deuteronomy 8, I think I have verse 15 cited. We're actually going to back up a little bit. Deuteronomy 8, and let's go to verse 11. The text says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up. You forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock." And we'll stop there. There's more to this statement, but what is the point that's being made in this section, and why does he reference the production of water from the flinty rock, as it's stated here, to them? Why is this event recounted at this point? Okay, it's a very clear example of how God provides, along with several others that are mentioned here in this list. And it starts off by saying, "Take care lest you forget the Lord by not keeping his commandments." And so one of the things I'll tell you is that it defines what God means when he talks about people forgetting the Lord, which is what? To fail to keep his commandments. And he's concerned about the people particularly getting to a place where they have a lot provided to them in this world, where they have ample food, where they have wealth, where they have things that satiate and satisfy the needs of the body, and that bringing them to a place that they forget their reliance upon God and what God has done for them. And right there is where we need to understand and appreciate the power of this in our own lives. And before I go any further, I'm going to ask my wife, can you tell if the stream is running? It is? Okay. It just popped up. I'm like, usually it doesn't take that long to let me know that it's running. All right. Yes, sir. Well, we're going to get there, so hang on. Okay, right. There's two things that I think are important to note about that. Hopefully I'll remember both of them before I get back to them. Before I do that, I want to make a couple of comments about what you said. One, I think we are absolutely aware that Moses' soul was delivered. We know that he was one of the three that appeared in the Mount Transfiguration speaking to the Lord. There's no indication that Moses was not saved by God. What happened here with Moses was purely an example for the benefit of us so that we could learn from it. What happened to him was he was used by God in this way, And interestingly enough, it kind of puts some light on Revelation, what is that, 22:15? 2:15, or 2:10, or anyway, early in chapter 2, be ye faithful even unto death. Moses actually did forfeit his life on this earth, not because his body had grown old and couldn't support life anymore, but for God to use to teach and demonstrate to others something. And so he did retain his faithfulness even unto death. And so there's some value in picking that up. One thing that it shows it, and by the way, I'm going to make this clear, this is not by any stretch of the imagination the only time that Moses sinned. But when he died, he was told that this was specifically the thing that would keep him from entering the promised land. How many transgressions against God separate us from God and keep us from receiving his blessings? Do we have to sin 10 times or 20 times or 100 times? And there's lesson one, no. Here was Moses that was a prophet of God. He was the leader of God's children. He saw God. He was the deliverer of the law of God. He did all of these great things, and God did so many great works through him. We've studied the parting of the Red Sea that was done through Moses. He did all of these great things through Moses, and Moses is set forth as a type of Christ. But because of one transgression, he was not allowed to enter into the land of promise. And so there's something there for us to consider. And then the second one I want us to consider is one that I don't think we think about very often at all. And that's this: how many years separated the water from the rock event and Moses actually dying and not going into the promised land? Yes, somewhere between, we'll just be conservative, between 10 and 40. I don't know exactly where the Numbers 20 event happened in their wilderness wandering in terms of the timeline of it. I don't think it was quite 40 years, but it was close or getting toward that. For all the rest of that time, he was sustained by God. He had his life. He was provided food by God. All of these blessings came from God. He lived and lived and lived. And then he paid the consequence for the act that he had done. But here's a lesson for us. Listen, the consequences of sin are not always immediate. And just because we don't immediately lose something doesn't mean that what we've done is okay. And it doesn't mean that we won't be judged. What we have to do to avoid judgment is what? Repent and petition God, acknowledge to God our shortcomings, and petition him for forgiveness. Now, again, we want to make the point. I'm absolutely convinced that Moses' soul was delivered, but that these things happened to him as an example for us so that we could learn these important lessons about our relationship to God. There is no darkness in God at all. And so if I persist in darkness, I'm not in fellowship with God. And if I die out of fellowship with God, by the way, this happened to that entire generation of Israelites. If I die outside of fellowship with God, that is, without obeying his commands, then I cannot enter his rest. I don't receive the blessings that are promised. Was God faithful to give them the promised land? Yes. Had he already told, by the way, that generation, the generation that died in the wilderness, that included Moses, had he already told them the land is yours? And yet that entire generation didn't get it. Why? Is God not faithful? Can he not be trusted? And the answer is, of course, God is faithful and he can be trusted. The reason they didn't get it is because they didn't obey God and go in and take it. They didn't trust God. And so they died wandering aimlessly instead of following God into his rewards. There's just all kinds of lessons in that for us. If we go through this world charting our own course, doing our own thing, we are wandering around as aimlessly in the wilderness as the children of Israel were, and we will die apart from God as certainly as they did. And we have to keep those things in mind. Now, as to your first point that you brought up, connection between Christ and the water talked about in the New Testament, we are working that direction. We'll get there eventually. The next thing I want to talk about directly, unless somebody has some more questions or comments about the Deuteronomy passage. And what I want you to pick up particularly is the purpose for him bringing these great acts up. It's to remind the people, bring to their remembrance who God is, what God has done, so that they don't forget God and they don't transgress the will of God. We go to Judges now, 15. This is Samson. Samson here is one of the places that he defeats the Philistines. But I want to look at verses 18 and 19. He's taken the jawbone and he has slain the Philistine army, and it says he was very thirsty. And he called upon the Lord and said, "You've granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Now I'm going to stop right there for a second. And we're going to point out, number one, he does recognize that the great victory that was just won, he didn't win under his own power. He recognized that God gave him the victory, that he was used by God to accomplish these things. So credit him that, despite the fact that there are lots of things about Samson's character that kind of shows his arrogance and his preoccupation with himself and his own desires. In this case, that's not the problem. He acknowledges that God has done this great thing. But notice how closely akin his words are here to the words of the people of Israel that we read about in Exodus and Numbers. In those cases, they said, "God, you delivered us from the Egyptians and brought us out to this place for us to die because we don't have any water." And that's essentially what he says here. You gave me this great victory. Have you did it so that I shall now die of thirst? God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and the water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore, the name was called En Hakor. It is at Lehi to this day. I'm told that strange word means spring of him who called. And so that place became a memorial, at least for Samson and those who learned of this story, of God. Recognition that this was a spring that God supplied to those whom he had called. Samson, of course, had been called to be a judge and had been called to do these great things. This is another example of God doing this great thing, and it's done for the exact same reason that we have read about in these other places and other cases. It is done to remind Samson that God is there, that God provides, that he should not doubt the promises of God. That's exactly what had happened here. Samson didn't lack the ability to understand that God had given him this victory. He was just thirsty, really, really thirsty. And he was afraid that God wasn't going to supply his needs then. And the reminder here is what? God is there and God hasn't forgotten you. And so we see this now. To me, you read stories like this, I immediately connect it to Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. The worries and concerns that we have about provisions of daily living on this earth, they should be secondary. Those concerns should be secondary because we know that God is there, that God is watching, and that God is going to provide somehow. The opposite example of this lack of faith on the part of Samson is Abraham, who was asked to kill his child, his heir, according to promise, while he was yet a lad, And Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham believed that God would raise him from the dead if necessary to fulfill his promise. And that's why Abraham was willing to go ahead and make Isaac a sacrifice, because he believed that God would do whatever God needed to do in order to fulfill his promise. Question for you and me and everyone else is, do we have that kind of confidence in God fulfilling his promises? And are we more like Samson, who says, well, I know you've done this great thing for me, Lord. I know you've provided salvation for me through your Son, but have you done that only to let me suffer in this life? And Paul's attitude, by the way, the opposite attitude of that was, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in view of the things that God has done for me to deliver and save me. That there was no circumstances of life that could diminish that great blessing. So I've learned to be content wherever I find myself, whether I have want or whether I have an abundance. It doesn't matter. I'm aware of what God has done for me, and I'm aware that that surpasses it all. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can get through whatever circumstance it is, drawing my strength from God. And those are the kinds of things that we need to think about, and that these lessons are designed to provide. Go to the book, unless somebody has any questions or comments about that before we move on. All right, go to Nehemiah. And as you're turning over there, does someone know the general story of Nehemiah? Anybody remember what the general story of Nehemiah is? Okay. Jerusalem has been destroyed. Israel's been carried away into captivity. They're in Persia. Cyrus is king at this point. And a group has gone back under Ezra, but they have not rebuilt Jerusalem. News comes to Nehemiah that Jerusalem is still in ruins, that the walls are destroyed. He weeps over it, seeks favor from God, goes to King Cyrus and seeks permission to go and look at things, and if they're as bad as they're reported, to rebuild them. And so that's the general story of what's going on here. We want to look in chapter 9, and I think I have verse 6 is where we're going to start. Let's go ahead and start there and read through about verse 21. You are the Lord, you alone. You've made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that's on it, the seas and all that's in them, and you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you. You're the Lord, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made with him the covenant to give to his offspring the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, and the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite. You've kept your promise, for you're righteous. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt. You heard their cry at the Red Sea. Performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land, for you knew that they acted arrogantly against our fathers, and you made a name for yourself, and so it is to this day. You divided the sea before them, so that they went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and you cast their pursuers into the depths as a stone into the mighty waters. Okay, we've already studied the parting of the Red Sea in the Exodus. That's a reference to that. By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night, to light for them a way in which they should go. You came down on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments, and you made known to them your holy Sabbath, and commanded them commandments and statutes and a law by Moses your servant. You gave them bread from heaven for their hunger, and brought water for them out of the rock from their thirst, for their thirst. You told them to go in to possess the land that you had sworn to give them, but they and our fathers acted presumptuously, stiffened their neck, and did not obey your commandments. They refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders that you performed among them, but they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you're a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them, even when they had made for themselves a golden calf. And notice this is not set up in a timeline fashion. The golden calf came long before the refusal to go into Egypt. This is set up in a subject line to make a point. Even when they had made for themselves a golden calf and said, "This is your God who brought you out of Egypt," and had committed great blasphemies, you in your great mercies did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud led them in the way and did not depart from them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night to light for them in their way which they should go. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, did not withhold your manna from their mouth, gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. He goes on to talk about the kingdoms that were given to them and various other things. Why is Nehemiah rehearsing all this at this point? He's assembled all the people. That's what happens at the beginning of this chapter. 24th day of the month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting and in sackcloth, with earth on their heads. They had put dust on their heads. They separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins. This is a process in which they're being instructed and reminded about what gets in between people and God and what makes people unsuccessful, and reminding them of all of the great and powerful things that God did. And even when the people were unfaithful, there were certain things that God continued to do for them. Even though that generation had forsaken God and refused to obey His commandment, He continued to feed them. He continued to provide them water. He continued to keep clothes on them. God is a faithful God at all times. And there are certain things from God that all people receive, blessings. God causes His rain to fall upon the just and the unjust. There are certain things that, despite the fact that they weren't allowed to inherit the promise because they wouldn't obey His commandment, He still was there. The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire was there. The manna continued to come. Their clothes continued to be sustained. His presence was there. His blessings were still there. They had the opportunity to repent. And there's a lesson for us as well. Just because God is providing for us food, shelter, and clothing doesn't mean that we don't need to examine ourselves, make changes, acknowledge Him, and start seeking Him, because there are certain things that He's promised that are conditional. And if we're not obedient and we don't do everything that He says and go everywhere that He tells us, if we don't follow His word completely, we'll still find ourselves outside of those promises. And Nehemiah is reminding the people of that in an attempt to get them to do what? What's he want them to do? He wants them to confess and to repent. And by the way, that's what the people did. What happened as a result of that, by the way? Anybody remember the story? How does this story end? In a very short period of time, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and brought great glory to God. And it wasn't because of them that they accomplished such great things. It was because God's hand was with them. He blessed their work and made them successful and kept their enemies at bay. And that's what happens when we remain humble. Do you remember the warning that we read just a moment ago from Deuteronomy that said that God's concerned that when you have food and when you have clothing and when you have gold and you have silver, you're going to forget me? Same thing's being talked about here. Just because He provided them manna and water and shoes and clothes and the things of essence in this life didn't mean they didn't need to repent. It doesn't mean that we don't need to either. So we've got to keep that in mind. All right. I don't see any hands up. Let's go to the Psalms. There's a number of Psalms. There's a number that we're not going to reference, but there's a few here that we are. The 78th Psalm, I think, is the first one. Psalm 78, verses 15 and 16. This is a psalm about informing the next generation, the new generation, to tell the coming generation of the things of God, so that they don't forget God and they don't forget the works of God and they don't fail to keep His commandments. That's what this psalm is all about. Verses 15 and 16, He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. Now, this is a thing I don't think that we always think about when we think about God providing water from the rock. And I'll be honest with you, it's been a while since I've looked at any of the nice little color sheets that they have in Bible classes. But my memory of that is that it's not a very big rock, and it's just a slow little trickle of water that's coming out of it that's pictured in these drawings. There were hundreds of thousands of people. This was no small amount of water that He provided. He watered these people. He watered their livestock. He watered every desire. How much water does a city of 600,000 people go through in a day? And here in the middle of nowhere, where there is no water, there's nothing to be found, the earth is so parched that it drinks up the water. That's how it's described in the Bible. The ground is dry and it drinks up all the water. God creates enough water out of a rock to provide for all of these people. This was no small thing, and it's described here as being like rivers of water. And that's a significant statement that we shouldn't overlook or miss. Over in the 81st Psalm, this psalm is a psalm that is expressing desire on the part of God that the people would listen to Him, that they would just listen to His voice and His commandments. And in the midst of this, in verse 7, he says, "In distress you called, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah." Now, this one's interesting for two reasons. Number one, the fact that he names Meribah lets us know that this is talking about the events of Exodus. What was that, Exodus 17? Because they named it Meribah. It also lets us know that was actually a test. That the reason why God let them get thirsty was to see if they truly trusted in God or not. What should we do when we get to a place and we feel like there is a problem that we can't overcome that's threatening us, threatening our very lives even? You can't live very long without water. This was a threat to their life. What's the right thing to do in this case? What we see in what they did was they said, "Have you blessed us only to let us die out here?" Which is accusatory in nature. "Have you brought us out here to die? Is that why you saved us from Egypt, so we could be brought out here and you can kill us out here?" That's accusatory in nature. How should we handle such a problem? And by the way, those problems arise. Tests are allowed. James makes that perfectly clear. That we can find ourselves in very sticky situations that are potentially even threatening to our lives. What should our attitude be? I tell you what it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, "God, why are you doing this to me?" It shouldn't be accusing God of... You know what it should do? It should recognize the blessings of God and say, We know what you're capable of. If it's your will, provide for us these needs. How do I know that? Well, you look at people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who were about to be cast into a fiery furnace. And what did they say? They looked at the king who was about to cast them in there and said, go ahead. We serve a God that we know can deliver us, but even if he doesn't deliver us, we're not going to forsake him. That's the attitude that we have to have in these circumstances. That's the attitude that shows our true faith in God. I say this from time to time, and I think it's important for us to remember there is no promise. Well, I know, and he goes, I'm going to take promise out of there. We don't have every word that was spoken. We don't have a record of every event that took place. We know that for certainty, especially about Jesus' life. The Bible actually tells us that. We don't have every word of every sermon. What is here is a very focused, purposed transcript to provide for us the information that we need. And that's what we have. I don't know how many times he provided them water in the wilderness. The language here suggests that it might have been more than once. We know it was twice. It may have even been more than twice. I don't know. But I know this. They should never have doubted God's presence or his willingness to provide. And when we find ourselves in those situations, if we allow ourselves to be overtaken by the concerns and the worries of this life, and we allow those things to choke us out so that we don't bear the mature fruit of true faith in God, we get ourselves in trouble. That's the moral of this story. And that's what we're seeing repeated over and over and over again. Look at Psalm 95. This is a psalm about offering praise to God. We want to look at verse 8 particularly. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. Again, because it names Meribah, we know the exact event that he has under consideration. And notice how he characterizes their attitude. He says that though they had seen his work, they still put God to the test. What did they do? Well, I'll tell you what they did. They simply came out and said, what? Have you brought us out here to die? Have you brought us here to kill us? What should they have known about God after having dealt with God already? That he had their interest in mind and he was ready and able to provide for them. That, by the way, is how Paul learned to be content in whatever circumstances he was in. Even when he was in bad circumstances, he knew that God was there and he knew that God would provide in some way. By the way, you know what sometimes is the case? We don't like to talk about this very much. We don't like to talk about it at all, quite honestly. But sometimes the very relief that we cry out for may be that we're allowed to leave this earth. That may be the relief that God gives. Are we willing and prepared to accept that and to be grateful for God's continual provision? Do we trust that he's doing this, and are we ready to offer praise and thanksgiving to him for what he does? The 105th Psalm. And I got like 90 seconds before you ring the bell, something like that. 105th Psalm, verse 41. He opened the rock, and the water gushed out. It flowed through the desert like a river. For he remembered his holy promise, and Abraham his servant. Now it goes all the way back to the promise of Abraham, that through your seed all nations will be blessed. It ties this into the gospel message of the deliverance and provision of Christ. Why did he bring water to them? Because he made a promise to Abraham that through Abraham all nations would be blessed, and he was going to make that promise come to pass. And he made rivers of water appear in the wilderness. 107, verse 35. He turns a desert into pools of water, a parched land into springs of water. A reminder of God's power, God's ability, God's willingness to provide. And very quickly and lastly, before we run out of time completely, the 114th Psalm, verse 8. Actually, I'm going to read verse 7 too. This is a psalm, by the way, about trembling before God, being aware of His power. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. Not only was there a pool of water, but it continued to flow. It continued to well up and provide. How many people have the ability to turn rocks into water in the middle of the desert? Would you be afraid of someone who could do that? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord. Would you be inclined to respond to their making a request of you? All this is about realizing just what God is able to do, and what He has done, and what He continues to do. So that we remember Him, we remember His power, we listen to His words. Why did He lead them? Because He had a plan to deliver them. He brought them to the edge of the Red Sea, where it looked like they had nowhere to go, but He provided a way for them to go, to deliver them. The very same act that gave them dry land to pass over was the act that provided the vengeance of God against the enemies and stopped them from their pursuit when He closed the sea back upon the Egyptian army. God's always working. He always has a plan. He's always making deliverance possible for us. We just need to listen. And yet sometimes, either because of our prosperity in life or because of a lack thereof, and we've seen both extremes in these readings so far, either because we have so much or we have so little, we forget that God is there and God is working and God is providing. We have to remember these things. We'll look at the rest of these verses and we'll make the move into the New Testament. And I think the discussion will be a little bit longer once we get in the New Testament, as Christ is tied into all of these events. And the deliverance that Christ provides for us spiritually is tied into these events. It's important for us to understand those things. Any questions or comments before we stop? All right. Thank you for your presence, your participation, and for those who have been watching online.